Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thanks,
Chair.
Senator Rowland. Senator Rice.
Thank you, Chair. The National Cycling Strategy. So it was from 2011 to 2016, and so it's now ended. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Yes, although it has been extended to 2017.
Yes, it's been extended to the end of this year, Senator.
So, and the National Cycling Participation Survey, that's also going to be carried out this year. Is that the case? As part of it?
The National Cycling Participation Survey is conducted by the Australian Bicycle Council. The results are likely to be publicly available by the end of June.
Right, that sounds good. So, and the latest implementation report on the National Cycling Strategy says that the future national approach to cycling and walking will be determined in 2017. So what's the work that's going on for that now, and when will that future approach be determined?
So the states and territories have considered an independent review of the effectiveness of the strategy and the Australian Bicycle Council, and there is a state and territory working group developing options for the next steps for cycling cooperation between the jurisdictions.
So over what period of time then is that work occurring? When will we have those options?
I think the intention is that that work will be provided to Transport and Infrastructure Ministers ahead of their next meeting in November.
Okay, so we've got the strategy which is finished but been extended for this year. Future directions will go to the ministers then in November. When would it be expected? Is there an expectation that there will be another strategy to continue on?
That's a decision to be taken, Senator. We're awaiting the evaluation report, and then states and territories and the Commonwealth will have a look at that in determining the next steps on the strategy.
Okay. What work's actually going on at a federal level with regard to cycling at the moment?
Well, the Australian Government is funding its contribution to the Australian Bicycle Council, which is continuing its work this year. Additionally, as we've discussed previously, in our infrastructure investment program, we do fund a range of projects which involve providing active transport options, including bike paths and footpaths.
And as we have discussed in previous years, and I think I've asked you whether there is you are able to articulate what money is spent on cycling infrastructure at a federal level.
And we certainly have provided answers in relation to where, as part of land transport infrastructure projects, we have provided funding for active travel options. And I'm happy to take that on notice again.
Take that on notice as to what's currently planned, has been spent the last financial year, and what's planned to be spent.
Senator, as we've discussed previously too, I just would like to note that, of course, one of our key findings has been that the states and territories now have significant planning work going on in relation to urban amenity, and cycling has been a key take-up in that regard, and there is, I suppose, substantial work going on amongst the states and territories without influence from the Commonwealth as well in that regard.
Yes. Indeed, I mean, the 2016 implementation report said that last year state and territory governments spent $121.8 million on cycling networks. So you don't have the figures for what the Australian government has spent in the last year. Then you'd have to get that to me on
No, I don't,
notice.
because as you know, under the legislation, our investment has to be tied to a land transport investment project.
It has to be.
Yes, to qualify, because it has to be part of that project to be approved.
So,
Say
Senator,
a
we
road
don't
or
just
rail
fund
line.
cycle paths.
We don't have a dedicated program for cycle paths or footpaths.
But you're not restricted. I mean, you could have a dedicated fund, but there currently isn't one.
If the government was to establish a new program, but funding under the Infrastructure Investment Program under the Land Transport Act means that the project has to be part of a larger surface transport project.
So a cycling project doesn't count as a surface transport project in its own right?
Not of itself.
Okay. The report also noticed that the United Nations recommends at least 20% of the total transport budget be set aside to fund non-motorised transport programs. What's the Australian government's total transport budget?
This year?
Yes.
The portfolio is managing this year, I think, of the order of $10.5 billion. in programs across
10.5
billion,
billion.
which is a mix of infrastructure investment, transport programs ranging from safety and security, and support programs for communities is of that order of 10.5 to 11 billion. I'll give you an accurate figure of our total administered program spend.
So 20% of that 10 billion would be 2 billion, wouldn't it? We're laughably short of that recommendation, that UN recommendation.
I'd be interested to see if any nation was adhering to the UN recommendation.
But what's your... Yes, that may be the case, but there must be some justification in that UN program as to why 20% has been recommended.
Not in my experience of the United Nations, no.
Very good answer, Mr.
Does the federal government have any views as to what proportion of the transport? Is this an appropriate measure to use in terms of a proportion of the transport budget to be spent on active transport?
I'm not familiar with the United Nations work centre.
No, I've heard there have been a range of different programs. For example, I know the Bicycle Network for many years. They ran a program of documenting what local governments were spending, and for a certain proportion of their transport funding to be spent on cycling. So is that an approach that the federal government has considered, as setting a target for a proportion of its budget to be spent on cycling?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator, no. There have been, in the past, there was a dedicated program for a period. That is no longer in place. I'm not aware of any, certainly in my time in this role, I'm not aware of any proposal to set targets of overall spend in relation to bicycles or active travel.
The implementation report shows a sharp drop in the number of bike imports in the last year, which has been bucking a long-standing trend of increasing numbers of bikes being taken up. And it doesn't correlate that to participation data. It just says that the 2017 survey will perhaps elicit some information there. But don't we know from past participation surveys that the numbers of riders is actually flatlining? So is there anything that you think that we will be able to glean from, or is there any relevance in the fact that the number of bike imports has decreased?
I can't remember what the answer was.
I'm sorry, Senator, I don't think we can
Senator,
give you
there was a question that we took on notice from the, if not the last estimates, the estimates before that, Senator, but I apologise, I don't recall the answer that we gave at the time. I don't think flatlining was actually correct. I think it was still slightly increasing, but I'm happy to come back to you with that detail.
But the strategy over its 5 years had an overarching goal of doubling cycling participation. So we have had very small increases. We now know that the number of bikes being imported has decreased. So we haven't come anywhere near doubling participation, have we?
Not that I'm aware of, Senator, but again, I'm happy to take those figures on notice.
And so is there any assessment in the evaluation of the cycling strategy as to what went wrong, why we haven't doubled participation?
Well, I think we're awaiting this evaluation results, which would be able to at least give us some information on which we can have that conversation.
So we haven't got any preliminary, assessments, given that we've had a strategy in place for 5 years. It's come nowhere near achieving that doubling
Senator,
of participation.
The Australian Bicycle Council has been funded and supported by the various governments, but it set the strategy in relation to what it was trying to achieve itself, not ourselves in that regard.
But the federal government has a role. You acknowledge that?
We were supporting that work.
Yes.
Again, I'm happy to come back to you with more information in relation to your question, but I'm not familiar enough with the subject to be able to answer it now.
No. So you haven't done any review or evaluation of what needs to change at a federal level for the federal government to play its part in doubling cycling participation?
No, I'm not aware of any work in that regard.
No. So do you still think that that's an appropriate goal that we should have had for those during that 5 years?
I'm sorry, Senator, I can't comment.
Is that goal still being considered in future federal approach to cycling?
Again, I'd note that the strategy was actually not set by government. but happy to come back to you in relation to your questions. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough with the subject.
And so you haven't got any knowledge at all about what at a federal level we're going to do to reorient our plans to actually get us anywhere close to achieving the goal that was set out in 2011?
Senator, at the high level, we do know that there's been, as you've already pointed out, difficulties in achieving the objectives of the original strategy. But I think as Mr Murdoch has already said, that's the work that states and territories are going through at the moment, is thinking about what are the next steps in relation to their active transport strategies, and that's the work that's yet to come back for consideration by the Transport and Infrastructure Council. So I think what Ms Zelke is saying is it's too early for us to give you that advice.
Senator, we've also, the question that we took previously from you, my colleague has found the answer that we gave, and it does actually show the results of the third biennial National Cycling Participation Survey, which was managed by the Australian Bicycle Council, indicated that cycling participation had neither decreased nor increased significantly over the life of the National Cycling Strategy from 2011 to 2016, and it actually provided figures of the percentage of people who cycled in the past week. So in 2011 it was 17.8%, in 2013 16.6%, and then 2015 back up to 17.4%.
So flat line was fairly accurate
Yeah,
then.
my apologies.
Yes. So my understanding of one of the biggest limitations that's stopping people from cycling is lack of infrastructure so that people both are safe and feel safe when they are riding. My understanding also is that at both local government and state government levels, budget limitations are the critical factor in why there isn't more investment in cycling, particularly at a local government level. Having experience in local government, there's a lot of cycling plans there at local government levels that local governments just don't have the money to implement. Given that, would you accept that there is a role at a federal level to be funding cycling infrastructure on its own, not necessarily as part of other big road projects, in order to encourage people to cycle and to increase the rate of cycling participation?
I think that's a matter for government. I don't think we can express an opinion on that, Senator.
And so the learnings from the cycling strategy, you're saying it's too early at the moment to review those. I'm sure if any evaluation of the cycling strategy will show that that's the biggest gap in why we haven't been successful in doubling our rates of cycling.
And I think once we've had a chance to look at the evaluation, and then we can perhaps reach a judgment as to the value or otherwise of the Commonwealth's engagement in this matter, or whether it is best handled by state and local government with some degree of support as required. But the judgment on that is, as I said, ministers will consider it later in the year.
Thank you.